right, can y'all see my screen all right? It should have the Zapproved opening page there. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so happy to see you all here today in our last event of the year with our very special guest, Minda Harts, who I admire and just think she's an amazing human. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on. Zapproved conducts business in Portland and beyond, and we're making an effort to acknowledge the history of the area and work towards decolonization of the tech industry. Today, we honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tumwater, Walla bands of the Chinook, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. To find out more about the Native American community in the Portland area, please visit the website Leading with Tradition. This QR code can take you straight there. All right. Hello all, I'm Crystal Sinkoff, and I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Manager of Workplace Experience, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Zapproved. And Zapproved is a tech company that believes that at the heart of our business success is creating a culture of belonging. We are hiring and have positions open. If you are interested, you can follow this QR code to take you to our hiring page. And we would really like to thank TechTown PDX. TechTown is sponsoring this event and has sponsored our Lunch and Learn events for 2021. And they will be sponsoring us again in 2022. I'm real excited to announce that, so we can still continue to bring you great speakers like Minda to the virtual stage. We are having a few events coming up. Turning Awareness into Action by Dana Crawford. You can go to, but I will just talk to you about the event. We have an event with Dana Crawford coming up, and also an event with PDX Wit for the LGBTQ plus in tech series that I work on with my partner in life. And that's going to be authentic representation in the gaming industry on January 13th. We would love to see all of you at those events. And then we have a few community agreements to go over. So we are recording today's event. You should have seen that message pop up when you came into the room. So please be sure to be on mute throughout the event. There is going to be time for questions at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them to the chat or to Justin Martinez directly, who will be monitoring the chat. Really listen to understand the voices here and not to respond. And this is a place to learn and grow, so be open. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Minda Harts. I first met Minda when she came to Zapproved for her first book tour of her book, The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table. And I've since been following her leadership on social media and was very excited to see her announce the publication of her newest book released in October, Right Within, How to Heal from Racial Trauma in the Workplace. She's with us today to have a conversation about why Right Within, why now, and why this book is so important. Minda, welcome to our Lunch and Learn here at Zapproved.
Thank you, Crystal. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I know you could be anywhere right now and you're here with us, so very excited.
That's great. One of the things I really wanted to do was hear you read a passage from your new book. And so if you could share with us, that would be awesome.
Awesome. Well, I'm getting older, you all, so I have to put my glasses on. This is where we are. I'm going to read from a chapter called Maintenance, because as we're all on our healing journeys, they'll always require maintenance of us. Maintenance strategies really can make or break your healing progression. I remember attending a working lunch with an executive at my office. Let's call him Keith. I was staffing him for an important client meeting to close a significant deal. I considered this executive a good and decent man, and we got along great. I had no reason to think he didn't have my back. But then again, we had never been in a situation that would require him to have my back. At any rate, we sat down for lunch and waited on the clients, who were running about 10 minutes late. The clients were a married couple. The husband, John, was a white male, and his wife, Connie, was a woman of color. I had spent some time with Connie before, and we had a good rapport. I had met John briefly, but never spent any real time with him. To make a long story short, another Black man had been murdered by the police recently, and the story was dominating the news. And somehow it came up in conversation. At one point during lunch, John said, "I just don't get it. Why has it taken Black people so long to get themselves together? I mean, look at what happened with the Japanese, and they have been able to accomplish so much." My mouth dropped to the floor. Like, dude, you know I'm part of those Black people you speak of. I was beyond surprised, and I could see Connie and Keith trying to look away while John proceeded to keep his foot in his mouth. Before I knew it, I said, "I disagree. You can't compare the 100 of years of racial oppression that Black people faced in this country to Japanese people's experience in this country. Yes, they have experienced racial bias, yet many of those families received a form of reparations as well. But clearly John was trying to pit one group who was oppressed against another, which in my opinion is an anti-Black position. I remember taking a sip of water and saying an internal prayer that Connie would stop this jerk or that Keith would chime in, but neither of them said a mumbling word. They let him continue to inflict his ignorance of Black people on the only Black person sitting at the table. If my face could turn red, I'm sure it would have. At that point, I was determined not to go back and forth with this fool who had been sleeping during all of his history classes. I ended the conversation with, "Maybe this is a conversation we should save for dinner and drinks." I awkwardly laughed and shifted the topic back to the reason we were at lunch in the first place. After lunch, I was riding in the car with Keith and secretly hoping he might say something about what had transpired. But yet again, he was a colleague who couldn't or wouldn't step up for me when I needed him. His stop came first, and when he got out of the car, I felt tears well up in my eyes. I was triggered. Keith might as well have put me back in the office with Carrie. For some reason, I expected more from him, but then again, why did I? I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I wanted him to see me in that moment and feel what I felt. I wanted him to care. Also, I wanted to believe that Keith was different from my former colleagues who watched the racialized situations go down and did nothing. It's because of situations like this and others that I had to incorporate maintenance strategies, because my day doesn't end after someone says some BS. I still have to continue to work, take care of my family, and be present. I had to learn not to allow those racialized experiences to paralyze the rest of my day. I refused to let racism have power over me anymore. Later that evening, I met back up with Keith for a dinner with some other clients, not Connie and John, thank God. We both arrived early to chat about our game plan for dinner. When I was in the situation with Carrie, I hadn't advocated for myself in the ways I wanted to due to fear. This time, I got the courage to casually bring up the situation that had transpired at lunch. I asked Keith what he thought about what John had said. He seemed surprised that I had brought it up and replied, "Well, you know, I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." When he said those words, I felt like Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners. I wanted to take Keith straight to the moon. For the love of God, that man had the audacity to eat his lunch that we paid for and look me straight in the eye and make the case that Black people could have had a better shot at the American dream, but didn't work as hard as the Japanese. And Keith had the nerve to tell me that he didn't mean any harm. What the hell did John mean then, Keith? The memo, not the memo, right within. So, Crystal, I figured we'd jump into the deep end.
That is definitely the deep end. And I think it's probably something that a lot of people on this Zoom call can relate to. And when I think about the mental health and well-being, this maintenance that you're talking about, it's really an important part of this book and a part of that conversation that you shared, that story that you shared with us. How do you get through that? What are some of the things that you do to continue to move forward, to continue to write, to continue to talk? I think that I wouldn't know. I don't have that experience. So how do you confront that?
Yeah, I think that the first thing is us acknowledging it, right? Because I think for so long we have normalized this type of language, this type of behavior. And I'll be honest, you know, I was in my former life for 15 years. I just assumed that this was just the way it was for Black women in the workplace, or women of color, or anybody who felt like they were the only, right? You're just like, okay, well, this is just part of my day. This is what I have to deal with. You don't know any other way for it to be. But I realized that we don't have to normalize mistreatment. We don't have to normalize disrespect and being othered in every capacity. And once I realized that One of my favorite authors, her name is Audre Lorde, and she said, beware of feeling you're not good enough to deserve it. Do we not deserve humanity, dignity, respect, just like our other colleagues? And so that's when I started to think about, okay, well, two things can be true at the same time. This person might not have intended harm, but the impact is harmful. So with that information, what are we going to do to rectify this situation, right? And so I think it's important for us to have these conversations out loud, but the first step to healing is acknowledging, and not just internally, but acknowledging it inside the organizations and the companies that we work in, because we all have colleagues like Keith that will tell us, oh, so-and-so didn't mean any harm. Okay, that might be true, but the harm was caused. So what are we going to do to make sure that Johns of the workplace don't keep saying those things, don't keep doing those things? And I think we have to get to a point where we acknowledge that bad behavior and traumas do exist inside the workplace.
Yeah, there's always a risk associated with speaking, truth to power. Can you share with us some challenges that you faced when you've been practicing that?
Yeah, I think a lot of, at least a lot of my initial experience inside the workplace, sometimes when you're one of few or one of the only, your voice starts to get silenced and you start to shrink yourself, right? And so you start telling yourself that same story. Well, they didn't mean any harm. I knew what they meant. And you start dismissing how it makes you feel, right? And so I think that, part of this is, let's normalize having courageous conversations, right? I think a very big buzzword inside of most companies are, let's have courageous conversations. But people get really in their feelings when you come to them and say, hey, actually, what you said in the last meeting landed on me this way. And then 9 times out of 10, someone will say, well, you took it the wrong way. They'll dismiss what you said or whatever have you. And I know back in my former life, sometimes I'd end up apologizing. Oh, well, I apologize. I must have took it the wrong way. It's like, really? But when you're in these type of situations, that's the type of coping mechanisms that you find to try to make it through the day. And so I think that speaking truth to power shouldn't be a revolutionary act. That if we talk about equity in the workplace, then that should be table stakes, right? It should be okay to be able to come with my concerns if it's causing me harm. And if I'm being courageous to come and talk to you about it, which it's probably happened 100 times before I got the courage to come and tell you about it. On the other end, I hope that as leaders, as managers, as colleagues, as allies, that we would also be courageous listeners, right? Again, your intention might not have been to say or do the thing, but you did say or do the thing. So now you need to take a listen and don't make it about you and your ego and any fragility, and say, you know what, thank you for feeling comfortable telling me this. Crystal, if you don't mind, just to kind of bring this home, is we all are susceptible to making mistakes, right? No, we're all human. So sometimes we're going to say or do the wrong thing, but it's taking that ownership and being that courageous listener so that we create that psychological safety so that people feel comfortable to tell us when we've made a mistake. I teach at NYU, and one semester I thought to myself, okay, well, people are talking more and more about preferred pronouns and language is changing and evolving. And I thought to myself, I'm a really progressive person, Minda, so in this particular year, I said, oh, I'm going to ask all the students first day of class, go around, give your name, your bio, say your pronouns. I was patting myself on the back before the class even started. And I'm like, this is revolutionary, right? At this period of time. And at the end of the class, one student waited till the end and asked me, Professor Harts, can I talk to you? And I said, yes, of course. And she says, I just wanted to make you aware, I'm sure you didn't intend it, but when you asked everybody to go around and say their pronouns, there might have been people who don't feel comfortable doing that. You may have been asking people to out themselves. And, I thanked her for telling me that, because obviously that was not my intention, but I'm glad that she felt safe enough with the power dynamics to be able to come and tell me that. Right. And so I didn't get in my feelings. I said, I apologized, number one. And number two, I said, thank you, because it takes a lot of courage for someone to come and tell you that. Right. Again, two things can be true at the same time. I was trying to create a safe space, but she alerted me that I wasn't necessarily doing that. And then the next time I taught the class with the new information that I had, not that particular class, because I already made that misstep, right? But when I taught the course again the next time around, I put on the board 5 things. I included pronouns in those 5 things. And as the people went around, I said, you pick the 3 things that you feel comfortable talking to us about. So that was my signal to say, if you feel comfortable in this space, you can say that, right? So I think so I give that story to say that we all fall into these buckets at times, but it's the recovery. And I think being courageous on both sides is really important if we're going to make a more equitable workplace.
Well, that's really great advice. I've had the same thing happen to me when I am doing trainings and in front of people. That same thing's been brought up to me before. So thank you for sharing that. Are there any additional ways that white men and white women can be allies in promoting women of color on like a daily basis, on a quarterly basis, so ongoing support for the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that if we were to do a poll here and we asked everyone who considers themselves an ally, I'm assuming that most people would consider themselves an ally. We would say that, right? But what we have to really interrogate and investigate is the demonstration of allyship, right? So yes, it's one thing to call yourself, but ask yourself another question. When was the last time that I demonstrated allyship to somebody? When was the last time that somebody benefited from my allyship? That's a very different answer, right? So just to say I'm an ally and put the badge on, that's not necessarily helping anybody. It's not making the workplace better than we found it, but it's in the demonstration, it's in the action. So you think about over the course of the last year, many companies said Black Lives Matter, racial justice matters, women in the workplace matters, all these sorts of things. But many companies have not demonstrated how, in fact, those groups matter. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, we need to move, not just having the conversation of allyship, but moving into demonstration. And I think we really need to demonstrate. And demonstration can look very differently. Sometimes I think we focus on, oh, well, I'm in a meeting and someone said, something egregious, and we want someone to, holler out in the Zoom call, Minda, don't say that again, whatever, right? Like that could be a way to be an ally, but there's other ways, right? In our hiring practices, who's on the hiring committees, making sure those are equitable, making sure that we do have flexible hours at our organization. There was one particular workplace report that came out a couple months ago, and it noted that over 50% of Black employees felt like they belonged at their companies for the first time during the pandemic, meaning the first time that they felt like they belonged at the company they worked at was when they were working from home, because they didn't have to deal with so many micro and macroaggressions every day that they felt in the office. They could actually just focus on the work. So if I'm thinking about allyship, I'm not going to say as a leader, everybody be back to work on December 15th. If I know that this is not a safe environment, I'm going to figure out what do we need to do to put the necessary steps in place so that some of our stakeholders feel comfortable coming back into this environment. It's not enough to go back to normal, but we want to go back to better, right? And I think we all have to think about what that looks like as managers, as leaders, and committing to daily acts of equity. One thing that I have inside of Right Within is a manager's pledge, but each of us can take this because we're all leaders in some capacity, is we're committing to daily acts of equity. Equity has to be embedded in everything we do. And if we're being equitable, then that benefits women of color and it benefits any other group that's inside the workplace. And so I think we just have to think about the whole employee journey from start to finish. If I'm looking to come and work at a company, when I come to your website, do I see myself? Do I see the demonstration of allyship? Is the language there? Is the leadership there on the About Us pages? So I think allyship really does have a spectrum, and I hope that we think about it, the various nuances of allyship, and not just kind of these cookie cutter approaches to allyship.
Right, that's definitely, I think, this bias to action, right? Making sure that we are, I think I've seen a lot of that is a lot of people saying, this is what we believe in, but there's no follow-up. And I think that's been going on just forever. It just seems like we're in this constant wheel of, yes, we're allies, and it's not getting passed into the action. Can you give an example of a barrier that's unique to women of color that isn't commonly acknowledged? And when did you discover this issue?
I think that I like this question because there's a lot of, I think, barriers, but I think one in particular is, I'll use myself, for example. I think oftentimes we don't think about the privilege that each of us holds in different capacities. And one thing that I did early in my career, early in my life, even before I started corporate America, was I changed my name because my government name is ethnic to some, right? And I knew at that particular time that if I put my name on this resume, that may not get a phone call. You know, back then they used to call you on the phone. Now I'm aging myself a little bit, but they used to call you on the phone. And so if you're not comfortable saying someone's name that you see on the resume, you may not make that phone call, right? And I was very much aware of that. Not even, can I do the job or not? This is the things that many of us women of color, Black and brown women, are thinking about before we even go for it, right? And so I chose to use Minda because I'm like, oh, this will make white people comfortable because, you know, more white people tend to be in positions of power. It sounds like Linda, so we're good, right? You know, and I was thinking about those sorts of things even before getting an opportunity. And it's unfortunate that those are the sorts of things that we have to think about. Or, you know, what our hair looks like. Is it too black? Is it too this? Wait, I gotta have it as straight as I can possibly have it. I can't show up with braids. You know, you think about all these biases that come before we even get a chance to introduce ourselves. And so those are some of the things that, you know, Black and brown women, women of color have to think about before even applying for the job. And then once you get into the role, you know, this assimilation that seems to be very present inside dominant culture workplaces. And I think that's that emotional tax. That's why it was really important for me to write Right Within, because you don't realize how much sacrifices many of us make in workplaces to try to fit in, right, at the expense of our own well-being. And so, yes, things like salary, the wage gap, obviously women of color are affected by that. The management gap, when you think about CEOs at the top level, there's 2 Black women, but for a very long time there were none. But yet Black women were the most educated group in the country. So, you know, as many of us say, make it make sense, right? Like we're out here, we're doing this, but there has to be that demonstration. And I think, you know, partially is acknowledging that these inequities are taking place, right? And once we acknowledge them, then we can solve for them. And I think it's really important for us to do that. And equity doesn't mean we're just highlighting Black and brown women or women of color. It means that everyone has an opportunity to succeed inside the workplace. And I think, you know, sometimes people think this is a zero-sum game. Why are we just focusing on Black women, or why are we focusing on LGBTQ, or, you know, mothers? But if we're solving for equity, then everybody benefits in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think when you solve for folks that are getting the least amount of privilege, you're solving for everybody. You're solving for the entire community, I think.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we as corporate America are doing right as far as helping women of color in the workplace?
Yeah, you know, I know that no workplace is perfect, right? But what I will say is there was a time period in my life that I never thought that I would see corporate America or nonprofit industries talking about race in the way that we do today. Like, you know, when I was in my life, in my former life, people would say, don't play the race card, don't make it about race. You would get all of these messaging, like, don't make anything about race. So you never did, right? Or rarely, or if you did, you knew that that was probably, you know, your box would be waiting for you at the end of the day or something like that. But now it makes me, I'm very optimistic, Crystal, because we're talking about race in a real thoughtful way, right? You know, if you would have told me even 5 years ago that I would have, my first book would be a best-selling book about women of color in the workplace, have the opportunity to write about racial trauma in my new book, Right Within, and come to companies like yours to talk about this, I would have probably been like, yeah, right. Like, when hell freezes over, would people let me come and talk about this stuff, right? And now we're talking about it, and I think that that's like the first step toward it, right? We can't conquer what we can't confront, and for so long people wanted to sweep things under the rug, and so I'm really optimistic that the more we talk about, you know, inequity in the workplace, then we can solve for these things. It doesn't mean that we're racist or that we're sexist or homophobic, but it means that we have opportunity to do better when we acknowledge that everyone is not experiencing the workplace the same.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm thinking about there may be someone on this call on this Zoom call who's experiencing discrimination in a corporate environment right now? And what would be your advice to them to conquer these hardships? What should allies do if they witness this?
It's a great question. So the way that I kind of like view the workplace is, I'll give an analogy. When I was younger, I'm one of 3 kids. And so my parents, we come from very humble beginnings, but my parents would take us on an annual field trip, a family vacation, whatever you want to call it. And we drive to this theme park, and it's 3 hours from our house. So we'd go for like the weekend and we stay at the Residence Inn or something like that. And we'd get there, and my brothers, I would be on the hump, the middle seat, right? And for 3 hours, I'd be riding on this hump, very uncomfortable. Any of my middle seat riders out there. And my dad would always be driving, and my mom would always be in the passenger seat. And we'd get there, and every year when we get there, my parents be like, "Wasn't that such a great ride?" And in my head, I'd be thinking, "Were you not in the same car as us? You heard us fussing in the back seat. Don't touch me, you're in my space," all the things, right? And it made me think about the workplace, that some of us are working at the same place and experiencing that workplace very differently. There are people who will only ever get to drive the car, right? They don't even know what it feels like to sit in the back seat, let alone on the hump. They have access to everything they need. Their voice is heard. They can turn the dial. If they don't want to listen to Rihanna, they can turn it to Beyonce. Like, they have everything they want, right? There's people that we work with that are in the passenger seat, and they also have access that the people in the back don't have. And then, if you've been in any type of workplace, if a certain situation happens, that the person in the back seat, or if the only person of color in the back seat is feeling that bump every single time, right? What would it look like to reach back, look in the back and say, "Wow, Minda, I noticed that you've been working in this role for the last 5 years. Let me talk to you about what it's like for you to be the driver next time," right? Like, we all, when you think about where you sit in your organization, that's the question. Where do you sit in your organization? And can your seat, the seat that you sit in, can you make it better for someone who's not sitting in the seat that you're sitting in, right? And so you think about it, oftentimes we hear leaders say, "Well, no, that's not going on here." How would you know? When's the last time you had to sit on the hump? When's the last time you've been a Black woman in the workplace? What can you tell me that racism, sexism, homophobia doesn't exist here when you have not experienced that seat, right? And instead of telling someone they're not experiencing this, let's think about, if I do have access to the front seat, or if I do, what would it look like to make it better for somebody else, right? Because we all know that, again, not everybody is experiencing that workplace the same. And the more that we can take a look and insert our emotional intelligence and say, I do have it maybe good in the seat, and I'm not experiencing that, but what could I do? You know what? Let me use my voice in this way. If I know that something's happening, I may not say it in the moment, but what would it look like if I went to HR instead? Why does Minda always have to be the one that does that? What if I go and say, "You know what? I've been in a meeting and I noticed that there's some behaviors going on, and I just wanted to acknowledge that and make sure that it's on record." Like, how revolutionary that could be if we all take assessment of where we sit and how we can make it better for somebody else. And so I would encourage each of us to think about where we sit and how we can make it better, right? Even someone who's sitting on the hump, what would it look like if they had the access, they had the sponsorship, they had the mentorship of somebody in the front seat, right? And so when we all take a look at where we sit and how we can add value to somebody else's seat, then that's when we create a culture of allyship, right? It's a culture of allyship. And I think when you create the culture, then it's not these one-off situations of somebody speaking up in a team meeting. No, we're creating that from the get-go. And I think that's the most important thing that each of us can do. That's not just for white men and women, that's for each and every one of us, because at the core of this, Crystal, this is about humanity, in my opinion.
Yeah. Wow. Yes, exactly. I think that what you talked about being in the, it being a part of how we interact. So speaking up isn't something that's unusual. It's something that happens as a matter of course. It's a matter of how we do our business, building DEI into all the things that we do. I wanted to ask, let's see here. We're getting, I have one more thing I wanted to ask is really, before we go to questions, is if there's one thing you want to leave the folks on this call with, and for them to think about going forward as allies and as human beings, you said it's a human thing working together. If there's one thing you'd want to leave us all with, what would that be?
Yes. So a lot of what we're talking about, be it being right within, right? Lauryn Hill said, how you going to win if you ain't right within? We have to make sure that we're right within, right? Because a lot of us experience a lot of discrimination, a lot of traumas inside the workplace, and we can't wait on somebody else to try to heal us. We can heal ourselves. So that's first and foremost. But number two, we have to heal our workplaces, because there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of things that have been said, a lot of broken promises, those sorts of things. And so I think the more that we get to know each other and we build relationships, then that's also where the healing lies. The other part I would say is, one definition of courage is the ability to do something that frightens one. And each of us, if we lean into our courage and push aside our caution, then think about how many people benefit from our courage. Somebody gets to be a beneficiary of your courage if you activate it inside the workplace, right? And so I think about all the Black women that came before me. In my bedroom, actually, I have a picture of Harriet Tubman on a photo of Harriet Tubman on one wall, Shirley Chisholm on another, Colin Kaepernick on another, and Beyonce, of course. But but I think about, but when I wake up, I think about the courage that people took, that I'm a beneficiary of many people's courage that came before me. I get to benefit from that. And it's the reason why I do the work that I do in the workplace, because I want someone to be a beneficiary of my courage. So I ask each and every one of you, who are you willing to be courageous for? And when each of us is activating our courage, so many more people benefit from it. We want to make the workplace better than we found it. So if each of us does our part, then we make a more equitable workplace where everybody experiences and is able to do the best work of their career, free of this trauma.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that, Minda. I do think courage is so important. And I think about that, that courage to be uncomfortable and to learn. And I think that not knowing and learning is uncomfortable. It takes courage to just to move through that, so that we can make change, and so that we can make all our organizations, our cities, our world a better place. So thank you for sharing that. I'd like to open it up to questions. Justin, have we had any questions come through the chat?
I haven't seen any questions yet. Lots of support though, lots of kudos, good stuff.
All right, does anyone have any questions in the audience that you'd like to ask, Minda?
I'm sorry, Crystal, I didn't hear you.
Oh, I sort of put a weird pause in there. Any questions that anyone in the audience would like to ask Minda? We're so quiet. I'm looking for any raised hands.
Or comments.
Looks like, yeah, comments are welcome as well. Someone's asking, where do we buy your new book?
Yeah, I think we'll drop it in.
I'll drop it into the chat.
If you're not
Justin
tired of
did
my
that
voice,
for everybody.
If you're not tired of my voice, it's even on Audible. I narrated both of my books for better or worse.
I have a question.
Oh, yes, thank you.
This is Katie from Cinder. Minda, I've been following you for a while now and just really appreciate your voice. And as someone that is kind of working through their career and starting to develop, what was the trigger that kind of like inspired you to write about your experiences and be that like larger voice on that larger platform?
Yeah, thank you, Katie, for your kind words. And really, it was, I think, frustration. Right? You know, I was in a really toxic workplace, and it started to impede upon my mental health, where I'd get panic attacks and depression, and it was really, really horrible. And I thought that I had to make that work. I didn't know that I could give myself permission to find a workplace that I didn't just feel like I was surviving in, but that I could thrive in. And I thought, you know, at the time when I was experiencing this, I was, you know, in my early 30s, and I'm like, God, I cannot I can't keep this up till 65. Like, this is not sustainable. You know, I can't do it. But I didn't know there was any other way. I was waiting on somebody else to save me, but I realized that, and I was waiting on somebody else to activate their voice. And while I was waiting for all these so-called allies to show up, no one ever did, right? And I realized that I have a voice. I just have to decide how I want to use it. Each of us has a voice. We just have to decide how we want to use it. And after a really, really painful conversation where I finally got the courage to go and talk with one of the most senior women at the company I was working at to say, you know what, this is happening. I can't do this. Please help me figure out how to make this better. You know, she told me that there's nothing she could do about it, and that, you know, I need to decide if this is the place that I want to work or not, because the person that's causing this trauma, she's been here a long time, and they were friends and all those sorts of things. And I just felt so defeated, right? And I remember walking out of her office, it was on a Friday, and I grabbed my stuff in my cube and I walked to my car as quickly as I could. And I cried in the car because I had done everything that dominant culture said do. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, the first person to help my family go from, you know, low income to middle class. You know, I had done all of these things. I've changed my name. I mean, what else am I supposed to do to get a little respect in this workplace, right? And I cried a deep, deep cry in my car. And I cried the tears of my great-grandmother. I cried the tears of my grandmother. I cried the tears of my mother. I thought about every other woman who's had to cry in their car or cry in the bathroom or somewhere, right? And I felt like I didn't know what else to do. And I remember turning on the radio, and Whitney Houston's "Where Do Broken Hearts Go" comes on the radio. And at this point I'm laughing and crying because I said, wow, God, you have such a funny sense of humor. And I thought to myself, where do the broken hearts go of women of color when we can't take the workplace anymore? And it was in that car ride, in the car, 2014. I did not know what the future held for me, but in that car, I said, I will figure out how to use my voice so that someone will be a beneficiary of my courage. And we're here today because of that. And so that's the strength. You know, if you would have asked me in 2014, would I be sitting here talking to you about this or writing, you know, important books and being a thought leader in this space? I never would have imagined. But just think about, so where you sit, think about if you activate your courage, what's possible for you and for those who work with you or the future that will inherit the workplaces that we leave behind.
Thank you for sharing that. It's
We
hard
have
to,
gotten, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
yeah, I saw some questions in there, Justin. I was just going to say thanks for sharing that vulnerable moment. I think sharing our vulnerability really, I think it gives us strength that we don't know we have. So the next question I saw, Justin, is that have you seen good examples of ways that businesses can create safe people or processes that people can use to raise issues of race?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for, you know, folks putting all the love in the chat. I do appreciate all the support because I do believe success is not a solo sport. I didn't get here by myself, so thank you. Yeah, you know, one company in particular, I don't know the complete inner workings of it, but Salesforce, for example, they have like a hotline that folks can call, right? That's outside of HR, because I think sometimes HR, you know, I teach this course at NYU and we have a whole section about why everybody loves to hate HR, right? And I think that sometimes HR is not the place that most people feel comfortable with for whatever reasons. And so if it's not HR that they can go to and feel like their experiences are being heard and taken seriously, then there needs to be another space for them to go, right? And this hotline actually allows people to, the investigations to be had, you know, mentorship, coaching, you know, safety. And I think that that's really important. I talk about that a lot in Right Within, that, you know, psychological safety doesn't happen because we say it out loud 3 times and clap our hands. It doesn't create a psychological safe environment. It actually takes intentionality, right? So if HR, and this isn't to, you know, crap on HR, but if that is not the place for people to go and feel safe, then there has to be a place at work to do that without repercussion, right? So I think that we need to be very intentional about creating space so that there are places people can go without feeling like they're going to lose their job or that they're not being taken seriously. And I think that if we create those spaces, then it's really important to do that, because at the end of the day, we want people to be safe, because if safety is there, people get to do their best work, which means they're productive. And then that's good for business, right? Why would we want people full of fear at every turn? You can't do your best work that way. And so I think it's very important that we have these spaces, whatever mechanisms it is for us to do that. Another thing that I was in a closed door kind of conversation with some C-suite executives and CEOs, and one particular gentleman, he's a CEO of a global company, and he said one thing that he's doing differently as they return back to the office is taking a look at his management team, saying, if we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, do we have the right managers who can take us to that next level? Because let's be honest, sometimes managers are just as toxic as that create the toxicity, right? So if we want managers who need to have the cultural competency and the tools to be able to manage diverse teams, do we have the right leaders in place? Do they have the right training, right? Because I know when I was promoted to a leader, no one gave me any management training. They were just like, oh, you're doing such a great job, and now go manage 20 people, and try not to make their lives miserable, right? You know what I'm saying? So it's one of those things where we need to create those resources and tools so that everybody's set up to do the best work of their career.
Thank you. Justin, what's the next question that we have?
We have a question from our friends over at OBI and Otrati. Thank you, Minda, for your insights. A quick question: what's the next book you'll be publishing? Or is there something you're working on currently?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I have one more book and then my plan is to kind of take a break from writing books, but a third book is coming out in April. It's called You Are More Than Magic: Black and Brown Girls Claiming Their Voice. And so when I think about the work in my courage, I don't just want adult women and allies and leaders to be beneficiaries. I want the younger Mindas of the world to have the resources they need. And so I'm really excited about that book. It's a guide to helping young girls find their voice. That it's a cute thing to say, Black girl magic, but when the world still doesn't see you and value you, then it's just a cute saying. So what would it look like to really, really let people know that we are more than that? We are much more than that. And so I'm excited. That book is currently available on pre-order. So just get the whole Minda Harts collection, and life will be much better.
Love that. Justin, is there next in line?
Yes. Courage comes with acknowledging risk. You may step up, but also be stepped on. What about a truly toxic company? How do you gather allies and fight from within?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is part of the being right within, is also realizing that there are some battles just not worth fighting, right? Are we in a space where we're always constantly trying to convince people that your work matters, that your life matters, that these sort of inequalities matter? If we're constantly trying to convince people, then they're trying to strip away our dignity and humanity, right? And so that's not a workplace that you're ever going to be able to thrive in. And I'm not saying that people quit their jobs or any of those things. We are in spaces for various reasons, but I think we also have to stop trying to force people to do better, right? And focus on those. So not focus on who is never going to get it. Like I read the passage earlier about John. People like John, why would I be spinning my wheels talking to John about about allyship and about my life mattering? Like people like him are never going to get it. They have their thoughts, right? But there are others who we have identified that are our who, right? So don't focus on who isn't getting it, but focus on who is and rally those troops, right? And I think, sometimes we're trying to get everybody to get it, and it's just, some people don't want to get it. And I think that's where we are in the story, right? It's that you can have all these trainings, you can have all these conversations, and there are some people who will never, ever, ever, because they don't want to, right? And so we also have to decide, is this the place where I can do my best work? Or is this the place, not necessarily Zapproved, but is this the best place that I could do my best work? Or how do I make it work for me so that I'm preparing myself for my next best thing? But I'm at the point in my life where I'm not going to keep convincing you that my humanity is important. And so what I do know is what I can control, right? And it's good for me to know who is not for me, right? Because I'm not going to focus my energy on those people. I'm going to vibrate higher and go work with folks who really want to build and make a workplace better than we found it. And those are going to be the companies that win at the end of the day, because equity is important, right? Courageous conversations are normalized, that accountability is there, and that transparency is present. And I think, you know, the more that we do that, and again, not just me speaking truth to power, but if all of us continue to speak truth to power, then it's normalized, and those people start to weed themselves out, right? So I think that's important.
Great. Next, Justin, I see a lot of messages hitting the chat.
I have a question about holidays and celebrations. Is there something you appreciate when you see, or anything you wish companies would highlight more? This question partially comes from whether or not companies should celebrate things like Kwanzaa alongside Christmas and Hanukkah.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think that going back to the car ride, right? I think we have to think about, you know, we might work at the same place, but we don't experience it the same way. And I think, you know, the power of asking the right questions is important too. I think if you have people who celebrate Kwanzaa, then why not have an opportunity for a Zoom, you know, or a Google Hangout where people can hop in and have a moment to learn about that, or Hanukkah. I think it's about inclusion, right? I think it's important to be aware of that and ask those questions, right? Do we only celebrate, you know, our Black employees in February? Or if we create a culture of allyship, or create a culture of equity, then we're celebrating everybody every day, right? And I know that sounds kind of like pie in the sky, but I think most people just want that psychological safety. You know, for me, you can have Juneteenth, you can have Black History Month, you can have all the things, and I don't really give a crap if you have those days if the environment's not good, right? You know, so don't have any celebrations if you can't treat me with respect, right? So I think that that's partially kind of the vibe that I'm on, right? Like let's celebrate humanity each and every day, but I think ERGs are really good. Employee resource groups are good for that, to have those different intersections. But I think to acknowledge it, if you don't have a celebration perhaps, but maybe there's an email or something that comes out from leadership or CEO, I think just those acknowledgements go a very long way.
Absolutely, thank you. We have another good question. Thanks for writing this book and for sharing your journey through a mental health lens. I'm a psychologist and interested in focusing on employee wellness. Do you have any suggestions on how I can delve into that work?
Yes, well, since you're a psychologist, you're already by trade ready to go. So I think just making sure that you put your content out there so people can find it and start talking about it. And right within, I do focus on mental wellness because so much of my experience started to deteriorate my mental health. And I talk about, you know, therapy that I explored and other tools that worked for me. But the one thing, you know, I never intended on being an author. I never intended on writing these books. You know, I had hoped to one day, you know, stay in the C-suite and live my life in that way. But I just started to write, and I started to put my content out there. I started a newsletter back in 2015, and those newsletters turned into books. And so, you know, just start writing, start putting yourself out there, let people know, you know, what you're talking about. From the get-go, I pretty much started talking about women of color in the workplace, and over the years, then it started to catch on a little bit more. But back then, you know, people were not inviting me to speak because nobody really wanted to talk about the differences that women experienced in the workplace. And so even when you don't get the fanfare that you want, knowing that these topics are important because it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So excited for you to get going if you haven't already.
Great. Let's see here. Here's a question. In today's climate, would you suggest that people still alter their name to get opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right before the pandemic had happened, I was on a historically Black university college tour, and it struck me that every school I went to, regardless of the gender or identity, they would ask me two questions about career development. One, can they use their real names? And two, can they wear their natural hair? And I thought that was interesting questions. No one asked me like, how do you negotiate your salary? How do you do those sorts of things? They were thinking about names and how they show up, right? And which is interesting because in the workplace, we always talk about bring your authentic self to work. But what people are really saying is bring the version of yourself that I'm most comfortable with. And it actually hurt me that at all these different schools, those were the questions being asked, because those young adults were acutely aware of the biases that are already still very running rampant inside the workplace. And the one thing that I would say, I said it then, I still stand by it today, is that if I could go back and do it all over again, knowing what I know now, I probably would have used my full name, Minda. I would have used it because if a company didn't want to even bother to learn my name, then that was only going to be the beginning of my trouble. Right? You know, because you can modify yourself as much as you want to, but that's just only the beginning of the trouble. I would have preferred for people to at least attempt to try to say it and feel that inclusion from the get-go, right? Knowing that I didn't have to shrink myself or change to make other people feel better. And so what I say is, if you want to show up as your full self, start doing it, even if you've not been doing it your whole life, right? It's important for us to be able to do that, but you have to make that decision. So I wish that I would have used Minda, because I think I would have found maybe a few better workplaces and had a lot less skinned knees along the way. But also too, show up the ways that you need to for you, right? I used Minda because it was a survival strategy. It was the best tool that I had at the time. And so I think it's just important on how you want to show up. And that's, again, part of the work that I do is recentering ourselves. What would it look like if you do show up in this way, right? Who does it benefit? It hopefully will benefit you in the long run. But if you feel more comfortable, you know, some people like their names to be shortened, and that's who they want to be called. So I would just say, who do you need to be for you in the workplace? And that's the advice that I give.
Thank you. I have another question here. As allies, how can we show up and show we are available to support without taking up space in groups or channels that are for marginalized groups, or speaking on issues that are not in our lane?
Yeah, I think it's kind of it's a fine line, I think. The one thing that I do want to say about allyship is just like healing. Healing is not a one-time event. It's a lifestyle. I commit to each and every day on my healing journey, right? Because we live in a very toxic world. So there's things that will try to knock you off your game, right? But allyship, I think a lot of people often say, well, I can't believe so-and-so said that. I would never do something like that. But if you think about allyship, so many of us have gone to the doctor and the doctor will say, what's your pain point? And sometimes 10, you know, the scale of 1 to 10, 10 is excruciating, 1 is, you know, you can make it through the day. But some of us as allies, we may not be doing the 10 thing all the time, but we might be doing the 3 thing. If you do the 3 thing enough that's causing harm, it creates harm, right? And I think sometimes we think, I've read all the books, I've gone to all the seminars and workshops, I've arrived at allyship, right? I could teach the course. And that's not what allyship is. It's everyday acts of courage, right? It's showing up in everyday acts. But how I want someone to ally for me may be different than how Crystal wants someone to ally for her. And so part of that is getting to know us as individuals. I might appreciate you showing up in the chat for me, or, you know, saying, you know, I see that Minda's been trying to come off mute and people have been speaking over her. Minda, did you have something you wanted to say? I might appreciate somebody interjecting themselves in that way, whereas someone else would prefer to do it, you know, not in public. But the way we find that out is by getting to know people, right? But again, put yourself as allyship, you don't have to save the day, but you have to do something. And I think sometimes people get scared because they feel like they have to save the world. They got to do this grand act, right? I got to climb on top of the Empire State Building and do the thing. And it's the little acts, right? It's your tone in emails. It's, are we talking over people? You know, it's all these different things. And so think about what you're going to commit to each and every day. And if we all commit and take a hard look at ourselves and our behaviors, then if we listen, educate, and activate. So even if you're not a woman of color or you haven't experienced racial trauma, but you manage communities of color, you should be reading these books, right? We should be listening, we should be educating. And then once we have that, we should be activating. But just reading and not doing, or calling ourselves that, again, how are we demonstrating? Who is benefiting? And I think we have to commit to that practice and ask ourselves that question each and every day.
Thank you, Minda. That was awesome. We have 2 minutes left. And Justin, were there any more questions? I didn't see any, but maybe one came through.
Not that I saw.
Right. Okay, well then, is there any last words that you would like to share, Minda, in the last minute that we have here?
Well, again, thank you so much, Crystal, Justin, for all of you coming and for inviting me, but to all of you for spending your lunch with me. Please tell folks about Right Within and the memo. If you have opportunities to buy it for your leaders, do that, because I think, again, the more we are equipped to be better humans in the workplace, we can figure out, how we can make somebody else's seat a little bit better. So thank you.
Thank you, Minda, for being here and sharing your time and your stories with us. I really do appreciate that. It's been an honor. And thank you to everyone in the room. I appreciate you being here and listening as well. And I hope to see you again at a future Zapproved event. And may we all go into the day feeling stronger for this conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.